Good morning. For a very long time in Britain and Ireland, we've been able to outsource our complex relationship with apex predators to David Attenborough and National Geographic. No longer. As the calls grow louder and the plans more detailed to reintroduce at least some large carnivore species to these islands, could farming find ways to share landscapes with these species again? What do farmers think about these proposals, and what do they think about the suite of management and governance tools that can be used to facilitate coexistence? These were the questions swirling around my mind when I applied for a Nuffield Scholarship over 2 years ago, and it is the answers to some of these questions that I'd like to share with you this morning. So which large carnivores and which countries did I visit on my travels? Well, the Eurasian lynx, which is a medium-sized cat species about the size of a Springer Spaniel, is the most likely species to be reintroduced. There was a failed attempt about 6 years ago in England, which was declined in large part because of a lack of consultation with local communities and with farmers. But there are current plans to reintroduce lynx that are being consulted on in the north of England and in Scotland. And there was actually a national consultation on lynx reintroductions in Scotland earlier this year, the results of which are due to be announced in early 2025. With wolves, there are a couple of studies, but there are no actual projects because the risk to livestock and to people increases. With brown bears, which we also used to have in both of these islands, the risk increases again, and not only are there no projects under discussion, but there aren't even any studies. But each of these three species were present in at least some of the countries that I visited on my travels. 29,000 kilometers that took me to the USA, particularly the Mountain West, to the Netherlands and to Switzerland. 46 interviews with people from all walks of life, farmers, ranchers, hunters, entrepreneurs, those involved in reintroductions and those opposed to reintroductions. But I also talked to stakeholders here. I conducted 10 interviews with all of the farming unions across both islands, with 2 livestock organizations, and with 3 rewilding organizations that are either involved in reintroductions or that would like to be involved in the future. And what I came up with was something called the Reintroduction Coexistence Framework. This is a model to help everybody understand and visualize the complexities of this approach of sharing landscapes with farming and large carnivores. It's for everyone, whether you're for, whether you're against, or whether, like myself, you're somewhere in between. On the left, you can see the strategic factors, and I think you can agree that the strategic context for agriculture, particularly since Brexit, has been challenging. It is challenging, and it is likely to continue to be challenging. And when I talk to stakeholders in Britain and Ireland, many of the reasons for generally not being keen on the idea, in terms of drilling down to why they weren't keen, were because of these strategic factors: the political, the economic, the social, the technological, the legal, and the environmental. But that's not what I want to talk to you about today, although there is a chapter in my report which you can read if you're interested in this aspect. What I want to talk to you today about is the right-hand side of this model, which is what I call the coexistence toolkit. 5 different types of tools that are used to manage and govern this process in all of the different countries that I visited, as well as in many others: deterrence, finance, force, enterprise, and governance. Deterrence is the first tool in our toolkit, and it works by disrupting the attack sequence of a predator on livestock through things like fences and corrals, collars, livestock guardian animals like these dogs here, but also llamas and donkeys, and also expanded husbandry practices, having more people in a landscape. But it's expensive because it makes farming more labor-intensive. Of the 4 million Swiss francs spent on funding carnivore coexistence in Switzerland in 2021, 3 of those were not spent on funding farmers for lost sheep and cattle and horses. They were actually spent on funding and training and equipping deterrence. And when I talked to stakeholders in Britain and Ireland about that, there was a fair degree of skepticism about the economics of this, who's going to pay to feed and house this dog and all the others, but also about the logistics, who's going to actually feed and house and walk this dog for an entire year. Finance is the next tool in our toolkit. That mostly involves the compensation of farmers when they lose livestock, but it can also involve insurance schemes for livestock and proactive payments, so things like environmental performance payments. In the Netherlands, I visited this family and this farm who had lost 4 sheep to a wolf. And part of the problem is that the scheme had been poorly designed. They weren't in the risk zone, and so they were only offered partial compensation after 6 months, which they rejected. They sued their local government over that, and when I arrived, the court case was still ongoing. Complaints about bureaucracy are a very common concern about schemes like this right across the world. And in Britain and Ireland, unsurprisingly, there was a lot of discussion among all stakeholders about the verification effort that would be required to run schemes like this. And the other concern was about the long-term financial sustainability of funding compensation, not just over the 5 years of a pilot, but over 25, 50, frankly, the rest of the 21st century. The next tool in our toolkit is the use of force, which is a more controversial but completely unavoidable aspect of sharing landscapes with large carnivores. That includes hazing. You can see me practicing with bear spray here. Thankfully, I never had to use it in anger. Translocating, so removing or even potentially culling problem animals that develop a pattern of predating on livestock, a pattern that once set is extremely difficult to break. And when I was in Wyoming, I met the Game and Fish Department's large carnivore team, and they're on call 24/7, 365 to respond to ranchers when there's a problem with a predator on livestock, deploying force ethically, with effectiveness, and also driven by science and data. When I spoke to British and Irish stakeholders about this, there were concerns about the ethics of using force, there were concerns about the optics of using force, and there were concerns about the legality, particularly the potential protected status of reintroduced large carnivore species. The next tool in our toolkit is enterprise, and whereas the other 3 tools are about stopping bad things from happening to livestock from predators or dealing with them when they do happen, enterprise sees the potential from having predators in a landscape. It sees the opportunity to turn them from a problem into profit, particularly through tourism, but also through things like hunting and certification schemes. And in Montana, grizzly bear and wolf tourism adds tens of millions of dollars to the local economy every year, like this campground that I visited just outside Yellowstone. And I also visited an example of a predator-friendly certification scheme that pays farmers a premium and produces under a predator-friendly brand. In Britain and Ireland, there was acknowledgement that a trial links reintroduction, say, or a reintroduction may result in a tourism bonanza, but the main concern was that the benefits from this tourism activity flowed to those who were paying the economic price, and the sort of mechanisms that would be needed to make sure that that was fair. The last tool in our toolkit, and actually the most important tool in our toolkit, the foundation on which everything else sits, is governance. Governance includes things like guidelines and frameworks, policies, forums, dispute settlement mechanisms that bring and solve disputes between stakeholders with wildly differing perspectives on any given issue, spatial zoning. It all sounds incredibly boring, but it is actually incredibly important. In fact, the success or failure of these reintroduction proposals probably depend to a large extent on how they are governed. And in Colorado, I saw a good example of that. In 2020, there was a citizens' ballot initiative that mandated the reintroduction of wolves by the end of 2023. And Colorado State University was involved in working with stakeholders from across the state, ranchers, hunters, reintroducers, urban, rural, bringing everyone together to create participatory governance, and to try and create a degree of compromise and support for this plan that had been voted on very narrowly by the citizens of Colorado. But as you can see from this photo, it's not possible to please everybody all of the time, and not everyone was happy, like this rancher that I went to visit just outside Walden. In Britain and Ireland, governance was the only area where there was a degree of consensus that it was really important. A tiny sliver of common ground, and yet an important sliver of common ground nonetheless. So in conclusion, there is limited support for the suite of management tools available to facilitate coexistence between large carnivores and farming amongst British stakeholders. But there is more support available for governance. And overall, that context in which these proposals are being discussed, as we've already alluded to, and as you know far better than I do, it is a challenging context in which this is occurring, meaning that my conclusions are that large carnivore reintroductions are likely to be costly, they're likely to be complex, and they're likely to be contested. But I've also come to the conclusion that they are more likely to happen than when I first set out on my Nuffield journey 2.5 years ago, especially a trial reintroduction of lynx to Scotland in the coming years. So I hope that this framework and this study can be useful for all stakeholders, those who are for and against, and those who are on that spectrum of opinions in between. What comes next on my Nuffield journey? Well, since I finished my report in March, I've started working in academia for the first time, just up the road at Queen's University. And I'm actually scoping a major multi-year follow-on project that will go into much greater detail and consider this across both of these islands over the rest of this century. And even at this early scoping stage, because it is neutral in outlook, it has input from farming organizations, from rewilding organizations, and also this time from regulatory organizations across multiple jurisdictions. But I also wrote a book about my travels, and that book will be out early next year. I'm delighted to tell you there will be a special discount available for Nuffield scholars. So put it on your Christmas reading list and shopping list for 2025. And lastly, I'd just like to thank everyone who's been involved in this professional sabbatical that is a Nuffield Scholarship, and everyone who's played their part. Thank you so much.